Women played an essential role on both sides of World War II. That much is a given. They served in official military roles that brought them closer to combat than ever before. In fact, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was so good at sniping she was nicknamed Lady Death. And who remembered the 588th Night Bomber Regiment that scared the Germans so bad they were later known as Night Witches? But have you ever heard of any of these brave women? Why are none of them given due credit for their role in the Second World War? It's clear that these ladies proved themselves on the front just as they did in the background. In this video, we'll look at women who contributed to the war effort but have sadly not been given the credit they're due. You may not know this, but the Soviet Union was the most mobilized of all the nations during World War II, with upward of 800,000 women enlisting in the Red Army during the conflict. And what's more is that more than half of these women served in frontline units, taking on roles of scouts, anti-aircraft gunners, tank drivers, and partition fighters. But the most dangerous and celebrated roles played by Soviet women were as pilots and snipers. In the fall of 1941, with invading German forces threatening Moscow, Marna Roskova, known as the Russian Amelia Earhart, convinced Joseph Stalin to authorize 3 regiments of female pilots. The most famous of these was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, whose pilots hit so many of their targets that the Germans started calling them the Nachtnechsen, or Night Witches. Using rickety plywood planes, the women of the 588th flew more than 30,000 missions and dropped more than 23 tons of bombs on the Nazis. 30 died and 24 received Hero of the Soviet Union medals, the nation's highest award for valor. Apart from them, nearly 2,500 Soviet women were trained as snipers, but many others took on roles without formal training. Assigned to infantry battalions, female snipers were tasked with targeting German frontline officers and picking them off as they advanced. One sniper, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, aka Lady Death, killed a confirmed 309 Germans, including 36 enemy snipers, in less than a year of service with the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division. Pavlichenko became very interested in shooting in her spare time and joined a local shooting club. There, she learned how to be a good shot. She went to Kiev University in the 1930s after she got married, had a son, and even got a master's degree in history. But after Operation Barbarossa and the Nazis' army invasion of Soviet territory, Pavlichenko joined the army and was put in the 25th Rifle Division. Pavlichenko could have become a nurse, but she chose to train as a sniper instead. She was one of 2,000 female snipers hired by the Red Army. After being wounded 4 separate times, she was taken out of combat by late 1942. But that wasn't the end for her. The Soviet government sent her to the United States, where she toured the country with Eleanor Roosevelt. And later, she worked for the Soviet Navy as a senior researcher. Numerous other women from all over the world made significant contributions to the war effort during World War II, from the Soviet Union to Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler initially insisted that women remain at home during the war, but more than 450,000 German women eventually joined auxiliary military forces. In the beginning, they were barred from using weapons and were warned not to become gun women. But as you probably know, in the last desperate months of the conflict, Hitler sent everyone to battle. He had planned to create an experimental women's infantry battalion, but the war ended before it could be raised. Nonetheless, 39 women received Germany's Iron Cross for the duty near the front, including nurses and pilots like Hannah Reich and Matilda Schiller-Stauffenberg. Of course, not everyone was so accepting of the new roles that women had started to take on. Great Britain wasn't so keen on letting women serve in the British military during World War II, and they were not allowed to take on combat roles. As the war continued and the need for manpower increased, women were increasingly used in non-combat roles, such as anti-aircraft units. One of the main units women served in was the Auxiliary Territorial Service, which was formed in 1938 and provided essential support to the British Army. The ATS was instrumental in the vital anti-aircraft units, which had the task of shooting down German planes during bombing raids. The ATS women were known as the AK girls and worked alongside men in mixed Royal Artillery batteries. Their duties included spotting enemy aircraft, setting the range and bearing on the aircraft guns, and handling ammunition, but they were prohibited from actually firing the guns themselves. ATS members were also assigned to searchlight units, which played a critical role in locating incoming German bombers for the gunners to aim at. The 93rd Searchlight Regiment, formed in October of 1942, was Britain's first all-female army regiment. It operated 72 searchlights outside of London, each staffed by a dozen women and one man to turn on the generator and fire a machine gun if necessary. Despite their non-combat roles, ATS women were exposed to danger, and more than 389 were killed or wounded during the conflict. As Major General Sir Frederick Pyle, who ordered the formation of the 93rd Searchlight Regiment, noted, "The girls lived like men, fought their lights like men, and, alas, some of them died like men." Overall, more than 74,000 British women served in anti-aircraft units during the war, helping to defend their country and free up men for frontline combat roles. Then there was the Women's Land Army. During the Second World War, they played a significant role in boosting Britain's food production. Prior to the role, Britain had relied heavily on imported food, but the need to increase domestic production arose when the male agricultural workforce joined the armed forces. This led to the recruitment of women to provide a new rural workforce. The WLA, which had been disbanded after the First World War, was reformed in June of 1939. Initially, women were requested to volunteer to partake in the Land Army, and from the end of 1941, they could also be conscripted into land work. At its peak in 1944, there were over 80,000 women, known as land girls, working in the WLA. Despite partaking in such crucial work, you've probably never heard about them. Land girls worked a variety of jobs on the land, often in adverse weather conditions, and were directed to work anywhere in the country. By the autumn of 1941, more than 20,000 women had volunteered to serve in the WLA, including one-third who lived in cities like London. Many others lived on the farms where they worked, and as a larger number were recruited, hostels were set up to house them. So by 1944, 22,000 land girls could be found living across 700 hostels. Around one-quarter of all land girls were employed in dairy work by 1944. And some were trained to work in anti-vermin squads to combat pests like rats, foxes, rabbits, and moles. Farmers would directly pay the land girls who were employed by them, with the minimum wage at 28s per week, which is 14s was deducted for board and lodging. That was lower than the average wage for a male agricultural worker at 30s per week. Initially, they weren't even given holidays, but the introduction of the Land Girls Charter in 1943 improved working conditions and raised the minimum wage, with 1 week's holiday per year. Some land girls were also given the opportunity to carry out more specialized horticultural tasks, including work in private country houses or at a famous botanic gardens like Kew in Surrey. Efforts were made to transform areas of previously unsuitable land for farming, such as thousands of acres in Finland and East Anglia, where land girls operated heavy machineries like excavators and tractors. In 1942, the Women's Timber Corps, or lumberjills, were also set up to source and prepare wood needed urgently for pit props and telegraph poles. 6,000 women worked around the clock to ensure a constant wood supply was available. Land girls were not only additional workforce available to farmers, as almost 40,000 Italian prisoners of war were also working on British farms by 1943. The general public was also urged to help with farm labor, particularly at harvest time. Plus, special camps were set up to house interested volunteers. But women had taken up even scarier jobs than just farming. Eileen and Jacqueline Nearn, who were two sisters who played a significant role in World War II as secret agents working for the British Special Operations Executive, or as they'd call it, SOE. Born in England in the 1920s, Eileen and Jacqueline were both fluent in French and had spent their childhood in France, which made them ideal candidates for SOE operations in the country. Eileen, the elder sister, was trained as a radio operator and was dropped into France in March 1944 to work as a wireless operator in the French resistance network. Despite the risk of being caught by the German forces, Eileen successfully transmitted crucial information back to the British headquarters in London. However, she was eventually captured and tortured by the Gestapo, but refused to reveal any information about her comrades or her work. Eileen was eventually sent to a concentration camp, but she managed to escape during a forced march, which was eventually rescued by the U.S. Army. Jacqueline, the younger sister, was also recruited by the SOE and was trained as a courier. She was dropped into France in 1943 and worked with several resistant networks, transmitting messages, distributing weapons and ammunition, and helping to sabotage German installations. Like her sister, Jacqueline faced many dangers and narrowly escaped capture several times. After the war, both sisters were awarded medals for their bravery and service to their country. Eileen was awarded the Croix de Guerre and the George Cross, and Jacqueline received the Croix de Guerre and the MBE. British women had worked as hard as men to help their country survive during the war, but their contributions aren't remembered at the same pride as the British men. American women fared the same. Although women had served in military conflicts dating back to the American Revolution, it was during World War II that they were officially integrated into the United States military. At first, women were not allowed to participate in combat, but their contribution to the war effort was deemed necessary for victory. During World War II, 350,000 women served in the United States Armed Forces, with their own branches, like the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, later known as the Women's Army Corps or WAC, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots or WASP, and the Women Accepted for Volunteer Military Services, WAVES. Women also served in the Marines and a branch of the Coast Guard known as SPARS. Though many women had administrative roles, such as typists, clerks, and mail sorters, their contributions were critical in maintaining the bureaucratic machinery necessary for warfare. Women's participation in these positions allowed for more men to fight. While women were not allowed to participate in combat, many worked in the Army and Navy Medical Corps and were exposed to danger on the front lines. Numerous women from Minnesota, like Pearl Gullickson and Donnelly and Anne Boscano Green, made significant contributions during the war effort. The integration of women into the military during World War II was a groundbreaking moment in history, opening the doors for future generations of women to serve their country in various capacities. Jane Kennedy was an American pilot who played an essential role in World War II. She was born in 1920 in Minnesota and joined the Civil Air Patrol when she was just 20 years old. After completing her training, she served as a pilot and flight instructor during the war. Kennedy's primary responsibility was to fly missions in support of the military, also in search and rescue, target towing, and transporting personnel and equipment. She also helped train other pilots, both male and female, and was known for her exceptional flying skills and determination. Her most notable achievement during the war was her participation in the Women's Air Force Service Pilots program. The WASP was a pioneering program that trained women to fly military aircraft so that male pilots could be freed up for more combat duty. She was one of the first women to graduate from the WASP training program in 1943. Jane flew numerous missions of Army Air Force, including ferrying planes to various locations across the U.S., towing targets for live fire practice, and testing new planes for the military. Despite the important contributions of the WASP, the program was disbanded in 1944. And the women who served were not granted military status or benefits until decades later. While these efforts are brave, women in entertainment tried to offer support in other ways as well. During World War II, women played a significant role in the entertainment industry, both on and off the stage. With many men away fighting in the war, women were needed to fill the gaps in various entertainment roles. Women in entertainment worked as actresses, singers, dancers, musicians, and more, providing much-needed distraction and morale-boosting entertainment for troops and civilians alike. In the U.S., the entertainment industry had become a crucial part of the war effort, with the U.S. government even creating the United Service Organizations to provide entertainment for troops. The USO sent performers, including many women, to military bases and hospitals both in the U.S. and overseas to entertain soldiers and offer a sense of normalcy in difficult times. Some famous female performers who toured with the USO included Marlene Dietrich, Judy Garland, and Lena Horne. In Great Britain, the entertainment industry also played an important role in supporting the war effort. The famous Entertainers National Service Association was established to provide entertainment to British troops and civilians, and many female performers contributed to this effort. Some notable female performers included Vera Lynn, Gracie Fields, and Joyce Grenfell, who all performed for troops and boosted morale on the home front. Women were not only performers during the war, but they also worked behind the scenes in the entertainment industry. They were employed as scriptwriters, producers, and directors, among other roles. Women were also involved in the creation of propaganda films, which aimed to boost morale and support the war effort. The German filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl became known as her documentaries that served as propaganda for the Nazi Party. According to her own testimony, the outbreak of World War II and the rapid escalation of violence under the Nazi regime had negative consequences for Riefenstahl in her career. During the early stages of the Polish campaign, Riefenstahl witnessed the execution of Polish civilians in retaliation for a partisan attack on German troops while accompanying German soldiers near Konski. This incident seemed to have shaken Riefenstahl's confidence in the movement she had previously celebrated in her films. Despite leaving her filming that day to personally appeal to Hitler against such arbitrary violence, Riefenstahl went on to film Hitler's triumphant parade into Warsaw just a few weeks later. While the incident may have sown the seeds of doubt in Riefenstahl's mind, it did not stop her from continuing to work on propaganda films for the Nazi regime. All while some of these women have been ignored, those that suffered had been sidelined as well. There were numerous women who were unlucky enough to be caught and tortured brutally by the enemy forces. The treatment of female prisoners during World War II was often brutal and inhumane. Women were perceived as enemies of the state, resistance fighters, or even innocent civilians were subjected to various forms of physical and psychological abuse, including torture, sexual violence, and medical experimentation. In Nazi concentration camps, female prisoners were subjected to grueling forced labor, harsh living conditions, and often faced rape and sexual abuse by the guards. Many women were also subjected to medical experiments, including sterilization and forced abortions. In Japan prison camps, women were also captured were often forced to partake in comfort stations, where they were repeatedly abused. The comfort women system involved the forced recruitment of young women from occupied territories and using them to appease Japanese soldiers. In addition to these atrocities, female prisoners were often subjected to dehumanizing conditions, including lack of hygiene, malnutrition, and medical neglect. These experiences left many women traumatized for the rest of their lives, although none of these sacrifices are spoken about in the same light as the sacrifices of men. What's notable is that even with the war ending, the torture didn't end. The act of shaving the heads of women after the end of the Second World War was a degrading and humiliating practice carried out by various groups in different countries. It was mainly done to women who were suspected of having relationships with German soldiers or collaborators during the war. The women, who are often referred to as collaborators or traitors, were seen having brought shame and dishonor upon their communities and countries. In France, this practice was known as tondre, or to shave. It was carried out by vigilante groups, often with the support of local authorities, who would round up suspected collaborators and publicly shave their heads. The women would then be paraded through the streets, often with signs around their necks labeling them as traitors. The practice was particularly harsh in small villages where everyone knew everyone else's business, and it was not uncommon for family members to participate in the shaming of their own kin. The shaving of women's heads was not just confined to France. It also occurred in other countries like Belgium, Norway, and Netherlands. While it was primarily aimed at women, men were also targeted. The practice was controversial, to say the least, with some arguing that it was necessary to expose and punish traitors, while others condemned it as an act of cruelty and violation of human rights. The women repeatedly did everything in their power to help out and even suffered as much as men. Instead of focusing on the true worth of women, governments were instead worried about the return of men at the end of the Second World War. Sadly, the entry of women into traditionally male occupations renewed debates about equal pay. The trade unions were worried about the effect on men's wages once the war ended, and men would once again be working in these jobs. But the government prioritized the recruitment of workers at the time to service industries and the war effort. While some limited agreement on equal pay was reached, women's pay remained on average 53% of the pay of the men they replaced. To fight for equal pay, women's workers resorted to agitating on a local level, often without the support of their unions. In one instance, women workers at the Rolls-Royce plant in Hillington near Glasgow went on a one-week strike in 1943, which was also supported by most male workers too. Eventually, an understanding was reached on a set salary that was identical for men and women, depending on the kind of equipment they worked on. But still, things didn't change. Women were still discriminated against in other ways during World War II. For example, women were entitled to lower compensation for injuries compared to men under the Personal Injury Scheme 1939. Women were also at risk of being bombed but were still entitled to more inadequate compensation for injuries than men. Campaigners, trade unions, and some female parliamentarians took up this issue, and equal rights were introduced in April of 1943. With the raised employment of women throughout World War II, mothers' responsibility to care for their families had been addressed. State funding was supplied to set up over 1,340 wartime nurseries. This was a massive increase from the 14 similar nurseries which existed in 1940. But this wouldn't last, as it was always considered a temporary measure to help out the war efforts. Despite the gradual increase in women's employment rates since the 1920s, many still considered a married woman's place to be in the home. When the end of the Second World War finally came, many saw women being demobilized from the workforce, making way for men returning from war. In the late 1940s and 50s, however, were periods of sustained economic growth, which led to the expansion of job opportunities. The government encouraged women to enter or stay in their respective industries, and even encouraged the migration of staffers from one-time British colonies to fill the labor deficiencies. The welfare state produced many job prospects in what was considered women's work. Newly created jobs in the National Health Service, textile, banking, and light industries, such as electronics, offered women various opportunities in secretarial, clerical, and assembly work. However, gender segregation in the labor market remained prevalent, and routine, repetitive work was classified as women's work with lower wages. Despite the rise in the rate of women's employment, there was still thought of secondary workers, mainly because women's wages were not thought to be central to families' income and women were discouraged from working, particularly mothers with young children. Most of the state-funded nurseries set up during the Second World War were shut down by the post-war labor government. Not to mention, welfare payments for households were funded on the belief that a man's pay supported his wife and children, who were his dependents, the family wage, and so the benefits rates for married ladies were set at a much lower level than those for married men. In the 1950s, many employers still operated a marriage bar, which barred married women from certain occupations such as teaching and clerical jobs, but not lower-paid jobs, and those were sacked upon marriage. By the 1960s, however, it became more common for married women to work, at least part-time. Nevertheless, women were routinely sacked when they got pregnant, and their pay remained lower than that of men, even if they were doing the same jobs. Today, things might seem better to you from where you stand. Women can be found in various industries and no longer have trouble working even if they're pregnant, but most of the challenges still remain. But this didn't come to us easily. Women put their lives on the line on the front lines to prove that they could do everything that men could. And even when they weren't trusted to pull the trigger, they still stood by and offered support in every way they could. So while it may seem matters have improved for the better, women still have to strive to receive equal respect from the world for their equally important contributions, just like they did back then.